At the furthest ends of roads and towns sprawled Eagle's Ridge, stretching for miles and surrounded, squeezed tight by canyons and untamed trails. Half forgotten, it lay at the foot of the more imposing and expansive Idaho mountains. Railroads and highways twisted and turned, avoiding its ridges as if on purpose. Travelers shunned these new paths, and only occasionally would someone mention the obscure mountains on the horizon. This region had isolated itself, its inaccessibility sheltering it, and its sparse native population consisted of settlements of forgotten people who had turned their backs on the rest of the world. Only a handful of small towns remained alive, standing at the gates of dense carpets of diverse pine forests. One such little town had settled at the edge of the last roads, refusing to die. Despite its remoteness, Greenhaven sat near silver mines that had closed several years ago. Now its residents survived on tourism and the sale of deer, elk, and fox pelts to bold hunters who struck deals with the grim and hardened locals, people who seemed to know nothing of warmth or welcome. But while the unsuspecting hunters traded, visiting the town once a month, the attention of Greenhaven's lonely inhabitants turned to the dense forest that stretched up the slopes, disappearing behind massive ridges. It wasn't the beauty of the scenery that made them ready their rifles and unleash their dogs from their chains. It wasn't the view that kept them on edge, always aware of the wilderness lurking nearby. They remained silent and shivered in terror when night fell, and they flinched when they listened too closely to the hush of the thick woods, because they heard voices. Unseen shadows circled every night at the first line of pines, tormenting restless cats who watched through windows. These were not spirits of the land, though the region was steeped in forgotten myths and legends, whispers of which still echoed in dark corners. Nor were they chosen beasts, birthed by unknown origins and unknown forces. They were harbingers of Eagle's Ridge itself. Furious, insatiable, impatient mongrels of wolves and something far darker, creatures who knew no cold. Their purpose, long understood by the townsfolk, was singular: to slaughter as many people as possible and, in the end, devour all of Greenhaven, leaving rivers of blood on the virgin snow. Sometimes the branches shook with the sound of frequent gunfire. The people of Greenhaven would not bow to the forest monsters, werewolves at their doorsteps. Their eyes glowed green from the forest dark. Their fiery fur shimmered like smoke in the wind, hiding the swiftness of their figures. The footsteps of these phantom wolves were light and quick, yet the townsfolk managed, with mixed success, to shoot down the beasts of the forest from time to time. Even in death, their strange bodies glowed with a greenish light before disintegrating into fiery ash within seconds. They were larger and far more dangerous than any ordinary wild beasts. Their gaze revealed no reflection. Their eyes were black, like the moonless night. At death's door, one could never see their own face reflected in the black pools of their eyes. The townsfolk traded their goods for bullets with the hunters. The outsiders never asked what the isolated town needed so much ammunition for. The hunters didn't know that, within hours under the moonlight, the rifles would line up at the pines, bathed in blood and embraced by the cold. The werewolves would not retreat, would grind their teeth and tear into tree trunks with their claws, as if to quench their fury against Greenhaven. Green eyes surrounded the pines. The beasts growled, still unseen in the night's darkness. Bolts clicked shut, and the townsfolk refused to wait. A row of fire blinded the wild pack while dogs barked furiously at their owners' feet. Another volley of shots echoed. Birds, startled by the gunfire, erupted from the treetops, their fading silhouettes cutting across the yellow disk of the moon. The green glows vanished, the rifle barrels releasing faint wisps of smoke. Both the men and their dogs fell silent, listening to the forest. Somewhere deep inside, something tore through the snow, rushing and growling. Only the dogs heard it and could say nothing to their confident owners. Ears flattened, the dogs stepped back from the edge of the forest. Their owners stood still, rifles ready. They weren't scared because they couldn't see what the dogs had sensed. The werewolves were hiding nearby. If they wished, they would show themselves, bare their teeth, and savor the fear. But now they had disappeared into the darkness. Soon, even the dogs no longer heard their breathing. Finally, the rifles lowered. It was safe to exhale. The men turned back toward their homes, dogs in tow. Fewer than 100 people lived in Greenhaven. There was a small clinic and a library. The lights never fully went out, keeping the predators and the green eyes at bay. The dogs would bark at a moment's notice, sensing the special monsters of the forest, and immediately the rifles would spring into action against them. One of the town's guards was Tony. He'd been here since shortly after the mines closed. A hat, a sheepskin coat, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He waved goodbye to the others and trudged toward his porch. A dozen men and their dogs still lingered in the street, none of them cooled off yet from the night's battle. They had lit a bonfire and shared its warmth with their dogs. The rest of the townsfolk had retreated indoors. Tony watched their cabin windows glowing with light, where families welcomed them with firm embraces. Tony turned, looked at his own door, and, after a moment's pause, stepped inside. His cheeks flushed from the warmth as a cat brushed up against his boots, rubbing its side against him before he could kick them off. A dim light bulb hung lonely from the ceiling. The fireplace was black with soot, and the dark corners of the room were overgrown with cobwebs. "Tony, is that you?" "Yeah, Aunt Mabel. If you're not planning on going back out, lock the door tight." Tony did as she said. He brewed coffee and sat down at the table. Mabel Lewis had already gone to bed in the next room, long past caring about the forest troubles. Tony listened carefully to what was happening outside the window. The dogs had quieted, as had their owners. A few men, the more nervous ones, stayed out by the fire near the edge of town. Tony figured they wanted to. He himself was haunted by a sense of vulnerability. While he drank his coffee, the werewolves could be prowling nearby, just out of sight. He just had to calm down, forget the cold and the beasts. Tony drank his coffee in silence, glancing now and then at the frost outside. Despair and sorrow gnawed at him until he pulled a photograph from his pocket. A picture of a young woman holding a small child in her arms. The smooth surface of the photo reflected the dim light, its edges uneven and burned. He stared at the photograph for a long time, unblinking. Then he listened again. The silence in this place was unsettling. No barking, no howling. It didn't last long. The voices of the men by the fire returned, bringing with them a sense of calm. "Aunt Mabel, hand me the axe. I'll help you. You shouldn't be swinging that thing at your age. I need to move more, Tony. It's good for my health." It was midday. Sunlight lay sprawled across the snow. Dogs wandered here and there, having already forgotten the night before. "I'm always ready to help you, Auntie. You're always off hunting or helping the men with some task or another. There's never enough hands. Since George passed, I've had no one to lend me a hand now and then. You know how he was. Just say the word and he'd be out there helping. I've grown used to it. But when I think about how all that's left of his cabin are those burnt-out embers, my heart starts to ache. Well, you can count on me now. I'll drop whatever I'm doing and help you with anything. I'll manage one way or another. Chopping wood is no big deal. I still have plenty of strength left in me. You'd better not strain yourself, Auntie. Take it easy for a while." A dog ran up to Tony, a mutt called Tail. The right side of his body still hadn't fully healed, and part of one ear was missing. "Tail, where's your owner? Come here. Look what I've got. Good dog. Now let's find your owner." The road was lined with wagon tracks marked with ruts from carts hauling planks and stakes. Near the forest's edge they were building some sort of scaffolding, as far as Tony could make out. He wanted to take a closer look. But first, he and Tail headed for the library. Tail scared off a couple of cats perched on a rickety fence. "You'll pay for that later. Just wait. You'll find a whole gang of cats outside your doghouse tonight." Tail didn't care. He just bounced around, tongue hanging out. The whole town was a cluster of old pitched roofs, many of which desperately needed repairs. Some cabins stood empty. The homes left vacant, because their owners ended up in coffins were quickly passed on to those living under someone else's roof. After the mines shut down, some folks had chosen to stay in Greenhaven. Only the most decrepit and freezing homes remained abandoned. The library was a long, heated cabin with a cozy attic where a fireplace sat. The librarian, Michael, lived there. He was a 60-year-old man with a thick beard who at the moment was slumped drunkenly in a rocking chair by the fire. In his hands was Moby Dick, though it looked like he'd only managed the first page before dozing off. "Michael, I brought your dog." "Yeah, good. Take him over there," the man said, vaguely pointing in some random direction. "Figures." For Tail, Michael had saved a stash of chicken heads that the hunters brought in from the city 2 days ago. Tony tossed them to Tail, who eagerly dug in without complaint. "Get up already, clean this place up for God's sake," Tony said, picking up a book on folklore with a cover that showed a sharp-eared beast, and he placed it back on the shelf. "What am I even doing? I just came to feed Tail and make sure you were still alive, got it? Both jobs are done, so I'm out. You won't see me again today." "Wait, hey, Tony, this... well, just pass this on to Jack, will you? Some maps?" "Yeah, with notes about big grottos and caves. Drew it up just for him. Will you take it?" Michael hiccuped loudly. "I'll take it." Tony rolled up the sheets, glanced at the clock on the wall, and stepped outside the library. The brisk afternoon air hit him. Smoke drifted from the tree line. Tail had already finished his meal and lay contentedly on his good side. "Lucky you, Tail. I'd love to lie around and do nothing for about a month myself." The smoke came from the same fire that had burned the night before. Now, full-scale wooden fortifications were being erected, no resources spared. "Michael asked me to pass these along," Tony said, handing over the maps. "Thanks. You know, we confirmed yesterday that deep snow won't let us fend off a werewolf attack properly. Even a medium blizzard will completely disorient us. We'll sink under the snow, and they'll just run over our heads straight into town." "Michael, stand by these maps. You should have seen him. Ask him yourself if you don't believe me. He's drunk again, isn't he? Well, whatever. It's not him heading out there. It's us. He can afford it." By 1 o'clock, several thin columns of smoke curled up into the sky. At the edge of town, a group with rifles and dogs was gathering. By 2, they moved out toward the tall, stately pines. The trees stretched up into a gently rising slope, disappearing into ridges and valleys beyond. Crows cawed, their black eyes reflecting the column of people and dogs trudging through the snow. The birds flitted from branch to branch, following the group's slow progress. The column reached a narrow ravine, beyond which lay fallen trees scattered in the lowlands. Here began the vast expanse of Eagle's Ridge, stretching for hundreds of miles along the Idaho mountains. Yet even here, people might dwell. Greenhaven was the last real town, but beyond it lived all manner of people who cared nothing for the fate of any other town. Tony and the group stopped on a slope that overlooked the treetops. The rising wind stung his face. Tony couldn't shake the sight of the nearby ridges and the glowing fissures that split their surfaces at night. It might seem like the northern lights, but it couldn't be. It was a faint light, only visible on a clear night, a greenish glow, just like the eyes of those unknown wolves, the werewolves. The cliffs and peaks were riddled with those fissures and cracks, running from their bases all the way up to their icy caps. The snowy hills were covered in pines with shredded, almost marked trunks. Near them lay large chunks of wood, torn free, evidence of deep claws. All the injured and the dead, slightly more than a dozen, could testify to the ferocity of those claws. Those who hadn't been spared by the cold nights and the mysterious green glow of the mountains. And one could add to the tally George's cabin, burned to the ground with him inside. This mountain-locked region emanated a constant sense of unease. The shadow of the forests at the base of the nearby peaks rose sharply, cutting off the rest of the horizon, as though the pass revealed only what its will allowed. Crows soared as dark shapes high above the pines, watching the small group below. Where could the lair of the green werewolves, the creatures terrorizing the town, possibly be? Perhaps ordinary wolves had abandoned the pass when these unknown predators arrived to take their place. Were they even real? Or were they a shared hallucination? Maybe these creatures didn't exist at all. And if they did, why hadn't they appeared before? Why now? Tony and the others had no answers. The group crossed a small stretch of land just past the town, passed through a narrow corridor, descended a cliff, and found themselves facing the vast, seemingly endless expanse of Idaho, filled with hills, deadfalls, and grottos. What now? How many rock dwellings had they passed? Ones that could lead into darkness and never back out again. Could the countless glowing green eyes of the wild pack be hiding there? Tony recalled reading in a book about the nature and landscape of the pass that none of the caves or fissures in the rocks had ever been explored, except for the outermost ones, which barely counted as part of the region or the pass itself. During this walk, Tony was gripped by a desire to uncover the secrets of those caves, hidden beneath massive chains of mountains and guarded, no doubt, by the howls of the night. Howls that likely belonged to the green eyes, the so-called werewolves. After surveying and mentally cataloging the landscape, the group left traps in the narrow stone corridors connecting the town to the wider expanse. The traps were cleverly placed, designed so that no path could be taken without triggering at least one of them. On his way back, Tony discovered his photograph was missing, lost to a torn pocket, ripped by a sharp branch. An unpleasant loss, and the only one that truly stung. The snow would bury the photograph and keep it forever, hidden among the white fields. Tony's night was no better. There had been no attack, but in his dreams, he saw mountains glowing with an unnaturally bright green light. The howling of wolves surrounded him, close, so close he could feel their eyes in the darkness among the trees. Damn that howling. Louder and louder until Tony shot upright, the moonlight still faintly visible through the window. Silence. The porch creaked. Did he see a shadow? Or was he not fully awake yet? There was no one there, though a sweep of the lamplight across the doorway revealed faint, unreadable tracks outside. Someone, or something, had been there, leaving behind indistinct marks before disappearing into the night. What visions had taken root in his mind after that night? green glows deep in the forest shadows, the feeling of unseen beasts lurking in the darkness. He could tell Aunt Mabel little more than that. She prayed in response, chided him for lack of sleep and paranoia, and sternly told him to stop reading local folklore. Tony had heard how the old legends told strange, terrifying tales meant to spook children and adults alike. Yet such myths weren't uncommon among people across the world. Still, for these lands, the stories seemed particularly steeped in mysticism. The dreams didn't stop. They were always fragmented and unfinished, showing him the cold, nighttime Idaho wilderness, sometimes under a crimson moon, beneath which he could hear the singing and growling of creatures hidden in the dark. And then came the attack that jolted Tony awake. The green wolves burst from the forest, charging at the scaffolding and fortifications with terrifying speed. As they advanced, the mountains behind them lit up with the same vivid green glow, bright, alluring. That can't be. "What is that?" some of the men exclaimed. "The cursed pass favors the creatures of the forest." Perhaps that was true, Tony thought. It was all connected. The dreams, the ridges, the wolves with green eyes. What no one had expected was the chilling discovery made on their second trip to the narrow corridor. Not a single trap had been triggered. Even stranger was the fact that there were no wolf tracks at all. It was as if they hadn't passed through the ravine during the night, hadn't approached the town. The placement of the bear traps ruled out the possibility of the tracks being covered by a storm. The narrow ravine wouldn't allow it, certainly not in a single night. And besides, there hadn't been any storms for the past week. With this news, a new wave of terror washed over the town. It seemed the wolves had become an invincible, deadly breath of the pass itself. The psychological state of Tony and many others wavered that day. Tony's dreams took on a sinister, almost occult quality. Each time he closed his eyes, he was pulled into a thick, viscous darkness, with no return. Unlike normal dreams, where consciousness wandered freely and chaotically, these visions were disturbingly clear, resembling memories, or worse, an intrusion of some alien will into his mind. At first he saw streams of light, dim, green, poisonous, seeping through fissures deep within the mountains. The light spilled out like blood from a wound, turning the night sky into a grim, deathly painting. The dense forest beyond the ridges, usually cloaked in shadow, now emerged under this eerie glow. Far off, deep in the thickets among the broken pines, silhouettes began to appear. They always started as indistinct shapes, smudges of shadow like plumes of smoke, gathering into something alive. But soon the darkness would give way to form. Beasts. Unnaturally tall, with elongated heads and limbs that were far too long. They stood still as though listening, studying something, before their black, empty eyes fixed on him. Tony could feel his breathing falter in his sleep. His heart pounded so violently that he could almost hear it drumming in his ears. The figures in the forest, silent as death itself, stood motionless, staring at him. An unbearable pause, thick with horror, stretched on for a moment but felt like an eternity. Then, all at once, they turned their heads. The movement was synchronized, jerky, unnaturally sharp, like broken marionettes. Their eyes, those eyes were as black as night. No pupils, no reflections. Dark, endless voids that swallowed his gaze whole. Tony screamed, sharp, as though stabbed by a knife. He shot upright, lunging out of bed, throwing his blanket onto the floor. Sticky sweat covered his face and neck, and his damp shirt clung to his back. But there was something real that had carried over from the dream. Maybe folklore held some mention of, or at least something resembling, the strange occurrences unfolding now. Tony was no longer surprised by the abundance of myths and legends in these lands. Lonely, frigid territories, hidden away from civilization, gave people all the reason in the world to imagine and mystify. So Tony went to the library to find the right kind of literature. You had that book. I remember the cover. You must have imagined it. I don't have the kind of book you're describing. But Tony remembered clearly. The cover had shown a beast with a face just like in his dream. Its muzzle the same shape, its ears pointed. You're probably talking about this one, Tony. It's the only one that matches your description. Michael shoved a book into Tony's hands. Its cover was the same color, the same binding, except instead of a beast, it depicted a fox's tail tipped in white. This isn't it. I don't have another one. Yes, you do. I've seen it, the same one, but with a wolf. Please try to remember. Michael flopped into his chair, propping his feet up on a stool. I'm telling you, Tony, I don't have another. Tony took the book Michael gave him anyway, though he still wanted that one specific volume he was certain existed among the other tomes. That evening he pored over the book Michael had given him, but found nothing that resembled the green eyes. It spoke instead of the legend of the blood moon, and a pantheon that rejoiced beneath it. There were notes about an unknown beast of the pass, an embodiment of evil from another world. It mentioned flashes in the sky that occurred just before strange events, often accompanied by the unnerving feeling of being watched or unsafe anywhere. But nothing about the glowing mountains, the wolves, or the werewolves. Exhausted from the day, Tony collapsed onto his bed and fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. To his surprise, he didn't dream. He awoke when moonlight had spread like a carpet across the room. Something was scratching at the front door. Aunt Mabel, is that you? But she was snoring in her room, utterly unbothered, wrapped in heavy woolen blankets that shielded her from the winter cold and the anxieties of the night. Tony got up, bewildered by his abrupt awakening and the strange sound that wouldn't let him be. Slowly, he approached the door, carefully avoiding the creaking floorboards, as if any noise might awaken something lurking just beyond the threshold. Silence seemed to thicken around him. Usually, faint moonlight would filter through the keyhole, casting a thin beam onto the floor. But now it was blocked by an unnatural shadow, dense, immobile, and heavy like a wall. Tony froze, his hand suspended midair before the doorknob. He knew someone was standing outside the door, standing still, for far too long. It wasn't a mistake, not a trick of the eyes. He felt the presence deep in his bones. A chill crawled down his spine like an icy needle, leaving behind a shuddering tremor. And then something shifted beyond the door. The invisible entity realized it had been noticed. A sudden metallic clatter rang out as something yanked hard on the latch, rattling it on its hinges. The wooden door trembled under the blows, and from the dark corners of the room, old dust sifted down from the rafters, swirling in the dim lamplight. Tony stood paralyzed, horror locking him in place like a snake coiling around its prey. He couldn't scream, couldn't run. His fingers went numb, his legs refused to move. All he could do was stand there like a puppet with its strings cut, listening as the door groaned beneath the force of the intruder's strikes. The latch bent and buckled, ready to give way. His pulse pounded in his temples, and his breath shortened into sharp, ragged gasps. Suddenly there was a splintering crack. The door yielded. The latch tore free from the old wood, dangling loosely on rusted nails. The door creaked open, slowly, with a sound so long and terrible Tony wanted to clap his hands over his ears. A shadow, black as night, stood in the doorway. Tony couldn't make out the figure. He prepared to spring forward and attack, screaming to summon help. But then the shadow took several steps into the room, and Tony's fear paralyzed him completely. He bit his tongue, forgetting his plan to strike. From under the bed, he could see its legs, beastly legs, just one pair. It prowled across the room, loudly sniffing the air. Then it licked its lips. Tony could hear the sound, and let out something that almost sounded like a sinister chuckle. It placed something on the table near the bed and disappeared back into the night. On the table, Tony found his lost photograph, smeared slightly with blood. He didn't sleep again that night. The next day, Tony was quiet and withdrawn. What kind of creature had visited the house during the night? The photograph he'd lost in the forest was back. Though it should have been impossible, Tony held it in his hands, blood-stained. Aunt Mabel had to be given an explanation for the broken latch. Tony quickly said he'd gone out to look at the stars, and, in his impatience, had knocked the door open when he couldn't find the latch in the dark. Evening approached, and Tony didn't want to sleep. He didn't want to see more incomprehensible dreams or wake up in the dead of night. Would the creature return tonight? Tony didn't want to know the answer. He wandered through the town for a long time, staring at the slumbering ridges on the horizon. They radiated unease, and a mad, creeping fear filled his body. Then he noticed a pack of cats advancing unevenly but tightly toward Tail's doghouse. Tail, unwilling to put up a fight, simply crawled inside and gave a few half-hearted barks, as if to ward them off. He knew, however, that the cats were angry and feral. But then something startled them. The pack scattered in a panic, vaulting over fences and skittering across the ice, desperate to get away from the library. Tony heard it first as a faint rumble, like someone shifting furniture or dropping books onto the floor. But soon the noise grew. Dull thuds, splintering wood, the shatter of glass. At first he thought it was just the wind. Old buildings often groaned under the weather. But now loud voices, almost arguing, left no doubt. This wasn't the wind. Someone was inside the library. Tony crept to the side window, his heart pounding so hard he was sure they'd hear it outside. Carefully on his toes, he peeked in. Inside, illuminated by the dim glow of the fireplace, stood Michael. His face was pale and agitated, and he gestured wildly as if pleading with someone or something. Books and papers lay scattered everywhere. Shelves had been smashed, as if swept to the floor by a single massive blow. Shadows flickered across the walls, and Tony immediately knew he wasn't alone. Something big was in there. Holding his breath, he pressed against the wall, trying to remain unseen. But curiosity outweighed his fear. Cautiously, he looked again, and this time the full scene came into view. Tony clenched his teeth so hard his jaw ached, his fingers digging into the windowsill. In front of Michael stood two massive creatures. Their hulking forms barely fit within the room, making the light from the fire dance erratically across their matted, shaggy bodies. They looked like a grotesque cross between a wolf and a fox, predatory and beastly, yet impossibly elongated and twisted. Their fur clung in patches, thin and decayed like that of a corpse. But their faces, those were the worst of all. Instead of flesh, they had gleaming white skulls, polished as if by unseen hands. Empty eye sockets stared at Michael, exuding a lifeless, inhuman menace. Every movement of the creatures was accompanied by the sickening crunch of claws digging into the old wooden floorboards. Michael still tried to speak. His voice wavered but didn't break, as if he had already resigned himself to their presence, though panic glimmered in his eyes. He gestured as he spoke, his fingers trembling. I "I did everything," Michael stammered, his voice cracking. The creatures froze. They no longer growled, but their breathing filled the room. Heavy, like they were inhaling the very scent of Michael's fear. Then one of them took a step forward. The boards groaned under its weight. The terrible scraping sound of claws echoed again, and one of the creatures raised its arm. Long black claws glinted in the firelight. Tony, watching, couldn't look away. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot like a hunted animal caught in a trap. Michael stumbled back, pressing his spine against the shattered bookshelf. He lifted his hands in a feeble attempt to shield himself. "Please," he whispered. At that moment, Tony heard the words that sounded like a hoarse whisper mixed with a guttural growl. They didn't come from Michael. They came from the creatures. The skull's lips didn't move, yet the words slashed through the air. Warning, the book, against time. The voices scraped like nails on glass. Tony pressed his cheek against the cold window pane, straining to hear every word. He was terrified to miss a single one. The only reveal. Death. The words echoed through the room, as if the very walls repeated them over and over. Tony couldn't understand their meaning, but dread overtook him. Something ancient and powerful rang in those phrases, something his mind refused to accept. And then it happened all at once. The creature closest to Michael raised its claw higher. The talons flashed through the air and came down in one swift motion. Tony nearly cried out as he heard it. A wet, sickening thud. Michael's throat was slashed open in a single stroke. Blood sprayed across the books and walls. His body collapsed to the floor like a sack of stones, his eyes still open, wide with horror and shock. Silence filled the library. The creature tilted its head as though studying its handiwork. Then both skulls turned, their empty sockets staring directly at the window. At Tony. He froze. Their hollow eyes pierced him like daggers. The silence swelled, filling with a low, rumbling growl that seemed to rise from the depths of their throats. And then they smiled. Skulls weren't meant to smile, but Tony saw it. Their jaws parted slightly, and a dry, cracking laughter filled with mockery and malice flooded the room. Tony didn't remember how he bolted. He fell from the ledge, the snow biting his skin with icy cold, but he felt no pain. He ran as fast as he could. The snow crunched and sank beneath his feet, his breath turning into clouds of mist. The library faded behind him, but he could still feel their gaze. Those empty, haunting eye sockets. They watched him through walls, through the forest, through the darkness itself. Tony didn't recall how he made it back inside his house, into the warmth. The moon hung high outside the window. Aunt Mabel slept in the next room, undisturbed, while on the table sat the very book with the beast on its cover. The edges were stained, as though someone or something had touched it with bloody hands or paws. There was nowhere to run. What did these forest creatures want? What did they desire? Was the forest their domain? The moonlight fell onto the book, then onto the open pages. Tony began to read. The ancient inhabitants of these lands knew. The mountains held secrets beyond human understanding. Their peaks, shrouded in mist, seemed eternal. But beneath layers of stone, ice, and time lay abysses plunging into depths that could not have been formed by nature. The structures, erected in an era when man had yet to walk upright, were cyclopean palaces, silent witnesses to ancient cataclysms and otherworldly beings that had existed long before humanity appeared. It was a world of alien forms, of another reality altogether. Humanity could no more comprehend these ruins than an ant could fathom a city built by men. Who had built them? A now nameless, mysterious species, vanished without a trace. Perhaps they hadn't perished at all, but had instead moved on, to realms beyond the limits of our understanding. Yet their legacy remained. Massive portals carved deep into the mountains, cyclopean arches leading into voids, and corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls were covered with symbols unlike any human script and depictions of creatures that only vaguely resembled animals or men. In the dim light, the carvings seemed to writhe, playing tricks on the minds of those who dared stare for too long. Those who had lived for centuries at the base of these mountains told legends of the hounds of the pantheon, beings that wandered through worlds and dimensions, unrestrained by barriers or boundaries. The pantheon was not merely creatures but forces, capable of bending reality to their will. Their hounds were guardians and hunters, released onto Earth to fulfill the will of their masters. They tolerated no neighbors, allowing no humans to trespass on their territories, let alone uncover the secrets buried deep within the mountains. It was said that their presence was a sign. The pantheon itself was near, watching, waiting. They did not arrive in this world by chance. They had plans so vast and unfathomable that the human mind could never grasp them. The pantheon didn't hunger for land or souls. It sought ways to pull humans into its realms, to drag them where reality warped, where the laws of physics ceased to function, and where everything a man thought he was would be lost forever. They lured children and adults alike, promising wonders beyond imagining, the resurrection of lost loved ones, the fulfillment of deepest desires, eternal bliss. But the price was steep. Few dared descend into the caves where the ruins of the pantheon lay. Legends warned, anyone who used the powers locked within the mountain depths would gain passage to other worlds. Worlds beyond comparison to Earth. Yet those worlds were perilous. Toxic winds, light that burst eyes like overripe fruit, and spaces where time either froze or flowed in reverse. Breathing there was impossible. Thinking was impossible. Even the hounds, the harbingers of death, were but servants of the pantheon and its creators, not the masters of that realm. Those who wandered into those places returned mad, if they returned at all. A human who entered their dimension would lose everything that made him who he was. He would see impossible geometries, staircases leading into voids, rooms where walls simultaneously converged and stretched into infinity, windows through which one could see everything and nothing at once. He would perceive colors that no words could describe, colors that burned the mind like fire. His consciousness would shatter as it tried to accept this new reality, and he would lose the ability to see, think, and feel as he once had. The mind would become a cage. The soul would wander these realms alone, incapable of understanding what had happened. Those who followed the Pantheon's hounds left everything behind: memory, love, pain. Their bodies and souls transformed into something else. Entities without form, purpose, or name. The powers of the Pantheon, the elders said, could grant any dream, bring back the dead, fulfill cherished wishes, or bestow immortality. But in return, they took the most precious thing of all: the human essence. What made you yourself had no place in their reality. They would show you wonders beyond imagination, but they would take everything you loved in return. Now, as the mountains once again glowed with an ominous green light, the old tales returned to memory. People understood. The hounds of the Pantheon were here again. Their presence, was a harbinger of calamity, a sign that the pantheon was watching. Their shadows slithered among the trees. Their gazes pierced the hearts of those who dared look into the night. They would not suffer humans to trespass on their land, nor would they allow anyone to breach their boundaries. Learning all this, Tony felt a scream rise within him once more. The greenhounds, the glowing mountains, they were omens, omens of the pantheon, which hungered to drag Tony into its grasp in exchange for what? For a reunion with his family. The family Tony had lost and whose absence he had buried beneath the routine of life in this forgotten town after the mine shut down. They couldn't be brought back. Yet the demons of other worlds promised such a meeting. Tony's wife and daughter. In his dreams he heard drums. Cold. Idaho. The hounds gathered on either side of him. The mountains blazed with green flames, brighter than ever before. Ahead, two bipedal creatures with white skulls waited for him. They stood there watching, waiting for Tony. He moved forward without sinking into the snow as though he weighed nothing at all. This isn't a dream, Tony realized. The longing to see his family beat within his chest. The drumming grew louder with each step. The sky vanished, replaced by swirling green fire. Would it really be his family, or just flesh twisted and shaped to resemble his wife and daughter? They were dead. How could demonic forces resurrect them as they once were? Tony stopped halfway. He wanted to step back, but his body was frozen. He was allowed only to move forward. No, he wouldn't go. He wouldn't give himself over. Not for anything. The hounds screamed. The drums thundered so loudly that nothing else could be heard. His foot stepped forward. Tony fought the movement with all his strength. No, he wouldn't go. He wouldn't march toward his doom and their deception. The beasts howled. The jaws of the hounds snapped and screeched. Silence. He woke in his bed at dawn. The book was gone. The photograph was gone. Had they left him behind? Left him in the same state as before those terrible days? That night, people said, the mountains had glowed unbearably bright, and then the howling began, only to fade just as suddenly. Tony couldn't forget what he'd seen. It was as though the visions had been burned into his mind, forced into his memory against his will. The glow abandoned the mountains the following night and the nights after that. The hounds howled somewhere deep among the peaks, but they didn't attack. Weeks passed. Tony left the town at midday, promising to return by evening. He knew Michael had consorted with those creatures, but why? Why had he burned George's cabin with him inside? Had George known too much? Michael was undoubtedly a puppet of the creatures in the forest. Did he do it to save souls from eternal torment, unable to admit they would suffer endlessly? Or did he act out of fear, afraid the beasts would leave the land for a time only to return and silence him forever? No one could say for certain. Tony passed through the ravine, emerged onto the cliff, and descended into the caves. The damp, jagged stone quickly gave way to walls carved by unknown hands, their surfaces lined with inscriptions. Tony stepped into vast, empty cyclopean corridors. They stretched endlessly before him, their colossal arches, once functioning portals, now dormant and cold. The ceiling was too high to see, lost in shadow. The walls were etched with writings and depictions of many species that had once used this place, long before human time. The echo of his steps was swallowed up by the sheer enormity of the space, splintering into thousands of faint repetitions that dissipated into countless passageways. Tony wandered for a long time, studying the carvings. This place was infinite. Staircases and vast chasms dropped away into darkness. Tony dared not look into that abyss. A pure and primal fear had settled within him, a fear born of the very fabric of the universe. As he descended into the ravine, Tony felt the air grow heavier with each step, as though the earth itself resisted his advance. A cold wind whispered through the narrow passage, its voice rising and falling between the stone walls, though Tony could not discern the words. His steps echoed loudly, splitting into countless quiet repetitions, step, 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 like someone unseen was following him, mimicking his movements. When he reached the cliff's edge, the panorama stole his breath. Below him yawned a darkness so deep it seemed alive. The treetops, tiny and fragile, vanished into the thick gloom, and far below, the black mouth of a cave gaped open. Tony took a deep breath to steel himself, then began his descent. Every stone underfoot slid treacherously, as if nature itself sought to stop him. But Tony pressed on, lower and lower, until the cold pierced him like needles, stabbing through his skin. The caves greeted him with darkness and silence. The beam of his lantern cut through the black, revealing only fragments of his surroundings. Wet, gleaming stones, uneven ledges, ancient fissures descending who knew how far. Tony forced himself not to think about what might be lurking in the shadows just beyond the light's reach. The stone beneath his hands was icy and damp, exhaling an earthy, decaying scent. Something about this place was deeply wrong, unnatural, as if the walls and floors were not dead but alive, watching him. Suddenly, the chaotic natural cave gave way to order. The rough stone walls surrendered to man-made vaults. Tony froze, unable to tear his gaze away from the enormous, perfectly aligned stone slabs that formed the walls and ceiling. The light of his lantern danced across strange inscriptions carved into the surface. Ornate symbols twisted into knots and circles that made his eyes ache if he stared too long. They seemed alive. Who built this? The words escaped his lips, though the question felt absurd in this vast, silent void. Step by step, Tony moved forward. The corridors widened, stretching into infinity. Their arches soared so high that his lantern's beam couldn't reach the ceiling. Its light simply dissolved above him, as if swallowed by an endless abyss. The floor beneath his feet was polished smooth, like a mirror, and each step echoed oddly, the sound lingering too long before it faded. Tony couldn't understand why the echo sounded so wrong. It reflected off the walls, yet never quite disappeared. It felt as though something deep within the darkness was mimicking his steps, just a heartbeat slower. Step, pause, step, pause. Tony froze and turned around. There was no one there, only the darkness from which he'd come. The echo stopped, then resumed. Steps. But now they were not his. Someone, was following him. It's just an echo. Just an echo, he whispered to himself, gripping the lantern with trembling hands. But echoes couldn't be that heavy. They couldn't sound as though something massive and deliberate was trailing behind him. Tony quickened his pace, then broke into a run, his breath ragged, until he stumbled into the next chamber. And that chamber made his heart seize in his chest. It was vast, a cavernous room with a circular pit yawning in its center. Its edges were impossibly smooth, as though carved by giant hands. Strange images danced along the walls. Elongated, broken figures, hounds with gleaming white skulls for faces, people kneeling before them, hands outstretched. The longer Tony stared, the more it seemed the carvings moved. The creature's eyes tracked him, their pupils sliding over his silhouette. The outstretched hands of the people twitched in endless desperation. He blinked, and everything stilled. Only the void in the center stared back at him. A pit, he whispered to himself. Where does it lead? His mind refused to answer. yet something about it pulled at him. Tony stepped closer to the edge, and the air changed. From the black depths came a sound, not a howl, not a growl, but a low, resonant hum, like the breathing of something immense. It rose from below, heavy and deep, as though something was waking in the ink-black darkness. Tony stumbled back. The lantern in his hand wavered, the light flickering. For a moment, the darkness nearly consumed him. The fear that gripped him now was overwhelming. Not just instinctual, but pure existential terror. The space around him was not dead. It was alive. It was breathing along with the pit. Tony turned and bolted back the way he'd come. Behind him, the sound grew louder. The footsteps following him were no longer echoes. They were real. Something was moving in the depths. Something that had heard him and was now rising. He didn't dare look back. The light of his lantern bounced wildly, illuminating walls that seemed to shift and ripple, their strange symbols mocking him as he ran. But the corridors wouldn't end. Turns, staircases, arches, they blurred into one endless labyrinth, and one word pounded in his head like a drum: run. Tony ran blindly, his feet slipping on the smooth stone, his heart hammering in his temples, drowning out everything but the footsteps. They were closer now, heavy, deliberate, like the pounding of giant hammers. Whatever was behind him didn't need to hurry. It knew the labyrinth wouldn't release Tony. He had brought himself into the trap. Run, he repeated to himself, but the voice inside him grew quieter, choking on despair. A turn. A dead end. Another staircase leading down. He no longer knew how much time had passed. The corridors blurred into a single black void, and the lantern's light trembled like the last glimmer of hope. The walls around him seemed to come alive. The carvings etched into the stone shifted. Their elongated figures slithered across the surface, twisted faces stretching toward Tony, their hollow eye sockets boring into him. Not now. Not now. He exhaled, but his voice broke into a hoarse rasp. The lantern flickered. Once. Twice. Then it went out. Tony froze, nearly collapsing to the ground. Darkness engulfed him like an ocean wave, deafening and endless. He stood there, afraid to breathe. The silence was so thick he could hear the blood pounding in his temples. Somewhere in the depths of the cave, a sound emerged. A low, vibrating tone, almost musical. A hum, like the breathing of some vast creature, rolled through the labyrinth, and then fell silent. The footsteps stopped. Tony pressed his back against the wall, his chest rising and falling erratically as he listened. Nothing. He heard nothing. Not his pursuers, not even an echo. Only emptiness. And that was worse than anything else. The darkness began to suffocate him. It felt alive, shifting and reaching for him. Tony dropped to his knees, fumbling for the lantern with trembling hands. He pulled it out, shook it, struck it against his palm. A small light flared to life, flickering weakly. But it was enough for Tony to see. On the wall before him, something stood. It was a shadow, a tall, stretched figure, its silhouette blending with the stone. But the eyes in the center of the carving flared green, piercing into him. Tony stumbled back, and the lantern's light wavered. He realized. It wasn't a carving. It was it. The creature had been watching him through the stone, and now it was moving. The shadows around it began to converge into a single form, slithering toward the floor. A low, scraping sound echoed behind him. Tony turned. From the darkness they emerged, two figures with skulls where their faces should have been. Their eye sockets were empty, endless as night. Their massive silhouettes moved with a predator's grace, deliberate and unhurried. One of them lowered a clawed hand, its talons raking against the wall, leaving deep grooves in the stone. The sound they made wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a whisper, a chorus of voices, tangled together, speaking directly into Tony's ears. "Why are you here?" Tony didn't answer. He bolted to the side, not caring where the corridor led. His footsteps echoed through the cave, but now the echo sounded different, like it was mocking his frantic run. Behind him, he heard the creatures following, slowly, steadily, like hunters herding prey into a corner. The corridor narrowed. The air turned damp and stifling. Tony stumbled and fell to his knees. Ahead, at the far end of the tunnel, a door appeared, massive, stone, adorned with the same twisted symbols he had seen before. It glowed with a faint, sickly green light, and it was open. "No," Tony whispered, understanding that the light was luring him. He didn't want to go there. He couldn't go there. But the footsteps behind him grew louder, heavy thuds like hearts beating in time with his fear. He turned and saw their silhouettes in the lantern's dim glow. They filled the corridor completely, their shadows stretching like arms ready to seize him. "Tony," one of them whispered. Hearing his name shattered what remained of his will. He scrambled to his feet and rushed toward the door. The instant he crossed the threshold, the corridor behind him slammed shut. The cave trembled, and a deep hum filled the air. Before him stretched another chamber. It was vast. Tony froze in the center, staring up at a ceiling that disappeared into infinity. There were no shadows here, only green light seeping from cracks in the stone floor. In the center of the room lay a pit, a perfectly circular void from which emanated a frigid chill and a low resonant hum. Tony stepped forward, feeling its pull. The shadows had vanished. The pursuers were gone. Now he was alone. The entire world seemed to hold its breath, watching him. Is this the end or the beginning? The thought drifted through his mind. Tony took another step. He stood at the edge of the pit, staring into the absolute darkness that seemed alive. A hum rose from its depths, low and steady, like the breathing of a giant. Around him the hall shimmered with pale green light, bleeding from the cracks in the stone. The walls seemed to breathe, the lines etched into them pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Time felt frozen. Only the cold gnawed at his bones, and the sound of his own breathing echoed back to him. "What do you want?" His voice broke into a hoarse whisper. There was no answer, but Tony felt the darkness below respond, not with words, but with movement. Something stirred deep within, something enormous. A shape flickered at the edge of his perception, 1,000 eyes gleaming green, countless claws, and shadows swirling like a living storm. It was something from another reality, alien to the very fabric of this world. The footsteps behind him made him turn. The figures with skulls for faces stood at the entrance, silently watching him. Their eyes, empty, lifeless, no longer radiated menace. They were waiting for his decision. "It's a trap," he whispered to himself. But even now his mind clung to a thin, trembling hope. The voices of his family, his wife and daughter, sounded in his head again. "Tony, come back to us. We're here. Reach out your hand." He shut his eyes tight, clenching his teeth. Tears welled up, burning his vision. This was wrong. He knew they weren't here, that this was a lie, but how badly he wanted to believe it. To hear their voices, to feel their touch. Wasn't that worth any price? After all that remained in his life was loneliness and pain. No, he screamed, shattering the sweet whispers. The shadows roared in fury. The air trembled, the hall filled with an unbearable wail. The figures at the entrance moved, their claws scraping against the stone floor as they advanced toward Tony. Quickly. This is the end. He exhaled, and in that moment he understood. To stop this evil, to keep it from escaping, he had to sacrifice himself. He was the key, and if he stayed here, with the book, with the green light, with the abyss, he could seal the gateway. Tony stepped forward. The wind from the pit tore at him, pulling him toward its endless void. But in that moment he felt peace. The voices of his family faded, and the hum around him grew quieter. Only the cold and the darkness embraced him, carrying him away from this world. Days passed. Greenhaven was wrapped in silence. The cave lay dormant. The green light no longer glowed in the depths of the mountains, and the howling had disappeared from the night forest. The townsfolk began to return to their lives, though an unease still lingered in the air. Mabel stood on Tony's porch, holding an old photograph in her hands. It was covered in ash and stains, but the faces of his wife and daughter were still visible. Tears ran down her wrinkled cheeks, though she kept herself composed. "You did the right thing, Tony," she whispered. "The town was saved. But at what cost?" No one knew what had happened to Tony. His body was never found, and only those who ventured too close to the ravine said they sometimes heard footsteps. Footsteps and a faint, almost imperceptible hum rising from the depths of the mountains. Far off on the horizon, for the briefest moment, a faint green light flickered, and then it was gone.